Some killers stab, others shoot. But the ones we never see coming, the ones that haunt us, are the ones who kill without ever being in the room. They don't breathe down your neck. They don't stalk you in the dark. They let you do it to yourself. That's where this begins. With a hand reaching for a familiar red and white bottle, with a pop of a cap, with a swallowed capsule, and then a sudden collapse, a body hitting the floor, a family screaming from the other room. That's how it happened in Chicago in 1982. A city known for crime and corruption, yes, but not this. Not random death delivered by a painkiller. Not 7 people in separate homes, all gone within days of each other, all connected by something so ordinary no one could have imagined it would kill them. It started with a 12-year-old girl named Mary Kellerman. She had a cold. She stayed home from school. Her parents gave her Tylenol to help her feel better. Moments later, she was dead. The same day, 27-year-old Adam Janus dropped to the floor in front of his family. Later that night, his brother and sister-in-law, grieving in the same house, took pills from the same bottle and died. 7 victims in total. And as authorities scrambled to understand what was happening, the truth surfaced like a shark's fin. Someone was opening bottles of extra-strength Tylenol, filling the capsules with cyanide, and placing them back on store shelves. No demands, no manifesto, no warning, just death. Clean, quick, silent. The capsules looked normal, the seals were untouched, and yet each one contained enough poison to kill several people. What made this case horrifying wasn't just the randomness, it was the efficiency. Whoever did this didn't need to know their victims. They didn't even need to be near them. They didn't follow them home. They didn't choose them. They simply planted their weapon and waited. Investigators soon realized the scope. Bottles from different stores, different suburbs, all tampered with post-production. That meant the killer wasn't inside the factory. They were walking into drugstores, opening boxes, contaminating pills, resealing them, and walking out, all without being noticed. The public panicked. Hospitals overflowed with people who had taken Tylenol and feared they were next. Pharmacies pulled products. Stores locked their doors. News anchors told people to throw away anything they couldn't confirm was safe. Johnson & Johnson, Tylenol's manufacturer, issued a nationwide recall, 31 million bottles. It cost them over $100 million. But even in that chaos, even as investigators worked around the clock, the killer vanished. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no surveillance, nothing. And then a letter arrived. A man named James William Lewis claimed he would stop the killings if Johnson & Johnson paid him $1 million. They traced the letter to him. He was arrested for extortion, but they couldn't tie him to the poisonings. He lived in New York at the time. The logistics didn't add up. He served prison time, but not for murder. The Tylenol killer, if it was even him, walked away. The bottles stopped appearing. The deaths stopped, but the damage was permanent. We lock our doors because of home invasions. We look over our shoulders because of serial killers. But how do you protect yourself from something already in your home, already in your cabinet, already inside your body before you know you're in danger? The Chicago Tylenol murders changed everything. Congress passed the Federal Anti-Tampering Act. Pharmaceutical packaging transformed. Child-proof caps, safety seals, foil under lids, blister packs. These things exist because of that 1 week in 1982. Because someone turned a household product into a weapon and got away with it. Every time you peel back a safety seal today, you're touching a legacy of death. You're touching the aftermath of a killer who never needed a knife or a gun, just patience, anonymity, and malice. The case remains open. Technically, investigators revisit it now and then, hoping new forensics or digital tracing might reveal something missed. But the truth? Whoever did this planned it too well. They struck once, fast, wide, and then disappeared. That's what makes it disturbing. Not just the randomness, not just the silence, but the success. The killer proved it could be done. That mass murder didn't need bombs or bullets. It just needed a shelf, a label, and trust. And that trust was shattered permanently. In the end, 7 people died. Mary Kellerman, Adam Janus, Stanley Janus, Teresa Janus, Mary McFarland, Paula Prince, Mary Reiner. Their names are often lost beneath the headlines, but they are why we now open pills more cautiously, why we hesitate before swallowing something handed to us, why the word Tylenol will always have a shadow behind it. No one has ever been charged. No motive has ever been confirmed. Just the deaths, and the silence, and the knowledge that one person, for reasons still unknown, altered everyday life in America forever. This wasn't about poison, it was about fear, the kind that lingers, the kind that never fully leaves. And in that stillness, while the world kept turning, someone somewhere may still be watching, knowing they got away with it, waiting, perhaps, to do it again. The thing about cyanide is that it works fast. The moment it enters the bloodstream, it starts cutting off the body's oxygen supply on a cellular level. Victims don't go into shock slowly. They collapse, gasp for air that never reaches their lungs, and die within minutes. That was the medical horror the Chicago police faced as the Tylenol deaths began stacking up. And yet, the method wasn't what made this crime historic. It was the randomness. In most murder investigations, there's a motive, a pattern, a victim profile. But here, the only thing linking the victims was a brand name bottle. Police scrambled. Evidence bags were filled with containers, receipts, packaging, anything that could be connected to the deadly capsules. Forensic teams dissected pills under microscopes. Bottles were chemically tested. They discovered that in the contaminated capsules, the cyanide had been professionally measured and injected into the gelatin, not poured loosely, not sloppily, but with precision. Each poisoned capsule contained as much as 10,000 times the lethal dose. That level of accuracy suggested planning, chemistry knowledge, a methodical hand. Meanwhile, the media fueled mass hysteria. News outlets ran warnings hourly. Anchors held up Tylenol bottles like crime scene relics. One local news station ran the headline, "Don't take Tylenol until further notice." Panic was no longer localized. It was national. Johnson & Johnson, to their credit, moved fast. They didn't hide. They didn't deny. They issued a full recall, even before the FDA demanded it. 31 million bottles, gone from shelves overnight. Police stood guard outside pharmacies to stop theft. Hospitals opened toxicology hotlines. People dumped medicine in rivers, flushed it, burned it, refused to enter drugstores. At the epicenter of this collapse of public trust were 7 dead bodies and 1 invisible killer. The funeral for 12-year-old Mary Kellerman was packed with terrified parents who now clutched their own children like they could disappear in a breath. What terrified authorities most was the possibility of more bottles being tainted. There was no guarantee the killer had stopped. So the investigation stretched thin, casting a wide net. That's when the letter came. It was mailed to Johnson & Johnson's headquarters and postmarked from Chicago. It read like a ransom note. The sender claimed responsibility and demanded $1 million in exchange for stopping the poisonings. The letter was signed by a man named James William Lewis, who had a criminal background and lived in New York. The FBI tracked him down and arrested him. But there was a problem. Lewis had never been to Chicago during the time of the poisonings. He had no access to the drugstores. No concrete evidence tied him to the bottles themselves. He was sentenced, but only for attempted extortion. The murders remained untouched by the law. Some theorized Lewis was bluffing, hoping to capitalize on terror. Others still believe he was involved and simply covered his tracks too well. Still others insist the real killer has never spoken. Over time, copycats emerged in different cities. A woman died in New York after taking tainted Excedrin. Another case involved Sudafed in Washington. But the Tylenol case was different. Bigger, bolder, and still unsolved. In the years that followed, federal legislation transformed. The FDA introduced new requirements. Tamper-evident seals became mandatory, plastic rings, aluminum foil, breakable caps. All of it was built in direct response to this crime. Pharmaceutical companies began investing heavily in packaging science. Suddenly, the security of a product became part of its marketing. Now, with safety seal became a selling point. But no amount of reform could erase the original fear. Even today, for those who remember 1982, there's a moment, brief but sharp, every time they open a new bottle. A pause, a look, a memory, a trace of doubt. Some believe the killer may have been a disgruntled employee. Others suspect it was someone testing terrorism tactics. There's even a theory that it was a pharmaceutical competitor trying to sabotage Johnson & Johnson. But the truth is, all those theories hit the same wall. No evidence, no fingerprint, no witness, no one caught on camera. The poisonings stopped as suddenly as they began. That's what terrifies investigators to this day. Not just the crime, but its discipline. This was not the work of someone who got lucky. It was someone who had a plan, executed it with surgical care, and then disappeared. And that makes it unique among American murder cases. This wasn't about killing one person. It was about showing that anyone could die at any time, by their own hand, without knowing. In many ways, it was a psychological attack, as much as a physical one. And in that sense, it succeeded completely. Johnson & Johnson's reputation surprisingly survived. Many even praised their transparency. They were the first company to issue a national recall of this scale, and they became a model of corporate crisis response. But behind the boardroom praise and packaging updates, the fact remains: the killer got away. In 2023, the FBI quietly reopened parts of the case file, exploring new DNA tech. Some capsules had residue that may one day yield something traceable. But time is the enemy. Many involved in the original investigation have retired or passed away. Suspects have scattered, records degraded, and the fear, once white-hot, has faded from most people's minds. But not from everyone. Somewhere out there, someone knows what happened. Whether it was a man working alone in a garage, or someone in a lab coat, or someone with nothing but hate and a plan, someone did it. And they watched the country fall apart without lifting a finger. They saw panic on every TV screen. They saw their work paralyze an entire industry, and they've never had to answer for it. That silence, that calm, calculated silence, is what makes this crime a masterpiece of evil. Because it reminds us that danger doesn't always knock. Sometimes it waits quietly in your kitchen, on the counter, next to the toothbrush, disguised as help, daring you to trust it. There's something uniquely terrifying about a killer who never leaves a fingerprint. The Tylenol murderer vanished into the fog of speculation, leaving no face behind, just consequences. But what if the next killer wasn't invisible at all? What if he didn't try to hide? What if he lived in abandoned houses in plain view, walking among us with dead eyes, convinced he was untouchable because no one was looking? The next case doesn't deal with a phantom. It deals with a man who operated in broad daylight, a drifter, a manipulator, a murderer who was only discovered when one of his victims, by some miracle, called 911 while lying tied up beside him. Her voice, trembling and barely audible, would be the crack in a wall that had been standing far too long. The man was named Sean Great, and by the time police found him, 5 women were dead, their bodies decomposing inside crumbling houses that stood like forgotten tombs in small-town Ohio. What's horrifying about Great isn't just what he did, it's how long he did it without anyone noticing and how close he came to killing one more. The year was 2016, and the town was Ashland, Ohio, a quiet, middle-America place with decaying buildings, half-boarded windows, and a sense that nobody was really watching. Great had been drifting for years, living in abandoned homes and preying on women no one seemed to miss. His final known victim, a 911 hero, had been lured into a trap like the others. But she survived, and her call changed everything. She'd been tied up for days, held in a filthy room, raped repeatedly, threatened, starved, and left for dead. But on September 13th, while Great slept beside her, she managed to reach his phone. Her whisper on the emergency line is one of the most haunting recordings ever released. "I'm in a house. I'm tied up," she says, barely louder than a breath. The dispatcher strains to hear her, guiding her to stay calm, to describe her surroundings, to hold on. The call lasts several minutes, agonizingly slow. She doesn't know the address. She's disoriented. The dispatcher triangulates her location through the cell tower. Police are sent. She hears them arrive. They storm the house. Great is arrested on the spot, shirtless, disoriented, confused, but not surprised. Inside the house, officers find the woman bound to a mattress. But that's not all. In a nearby room, they find the decomposing body of a woman wrapped in blankets, bloodied, battered, long dead. She was Elizabeth Griffith, a woman with developmental challenges who had disappeared weeks earlier. Her family had been searching. Few had listened. Now, her body was evidence. Great confessed quickly, eagerly, as if proud. He told police about another woman in the same house, Stacy Stanley, whose body they also recovered. But he didn't stop there. He directed police to another abandoned home in nearby Richland County. Inside, they found the remains of two more women, Candace Cunningham and an unidentified victim believed to be his first kill. Great claimed responsibility for 5 murders, maybe more. He spoke about the women with chilling detachment, describing how he helped them die and how they were better off. He said they were using the system, wasting space, sinful. It wasn't just murder. It was cleansing in his mind. His words chilled investigators. There was no remorse, only justification. Great was a killer who had built his own twisted moral code, and within that code, what he did wasn't evil. It was ordained. What makes his case particularly disturbing is how long it went on. The women he targeted were often vulnerable, homeless, mentally ill, struggling with addiction, or estranged from family. He picked women who slipped through the cracks, who didn't have people checking in daily, who could go missing without immediate alarm. And when they did, Great moved on. His hunting grounds weren't back alleys or forests. They were forgotten buildings, empty homes with peeling wallpaper, dust-covered furniture, and no locks. Places no one wanted. That's where he hid his crimes, in the literal blind spots of the town. He'd often live with the bodies for days, sleep next to them, talk to them, sometimes even eat near them. His final victim, the woman who made the 911 call, said he referred to the corpses like they were still alive. That kind of detachment, mixed with delusion, is the hallmark of predatory psychosis. And it's what makes his crimes feel like they came from some ancient, rotted storybook. After his arrest, more victims came forward, women he had beaten, choked, or stalked. Some had escaped him in earlier years. They hadn't reported it. Or if they had, nothing had come of it. That failure, the blind eye of the system, is part of this crime. Great operated in a space of neglect. He weaponized invisibility, not his own, but his victims. Because if no one sees the women, no one sees the killer. In 2018, he was convicted on multiple counts of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. He sits now on death row, and yet, in every interview, he still acts like he's the one who was wronged. He speaks in biblical references. He talks about purity. He smiles. And you realize this wasn't just about sex or violence or control. It was about something far more unsettling. He believed he had a purpose, that he was chosen. And that's what separates monsters like Sean Great from everyday predators. He didn't just kill. He built a worldview to explain it, a structure to house it. And in that structure, truth no longer mattered. His victims weren't people, they were roles, characters, scapegoats, lessons. It's only by sheer chance that one woman survived long enough to pick up a phone and destroy his delusion. Without her, the house on Covert Court would still be standing, still silent, still deadly. And Great? He'd still be walking free, waiting for the next woman no one would miss. What makes a killer like Sean Great especially chilling isn't just the number of bodies or the grotesque conditions in which they were found. It's the slow realization that many of his victims had already been lost, long before he ever laid a hand on them. They were failed by society, forgotten by their communities, written off as unreliable or unimportant. And that's exactly what Great counted on, that people wouldn't care, that people wouldn't look, and in many cases, they didn't. Long before the 911 call that finally brought his crimes to light, Great had been operating in the shadows of Ohio's most neglected corners. He would find abandoned homes with broken windows, trash-strewn porches, and no running water, places where no one paid attention to who came and went. He used charm when needed, rage when it served him, and manipulation always. Some women he lured with promises of shelter, others with food. Some, like Candace Cunningham, even entered into what they believed were relationships. She was found buried behind a burnt-out house in Richland County. Great led the police there himself, said she had become difficult. That's how he described the women he killed, not by name, not by story, but by usefulness. When they stopped being easy to control, when they questioned him, or pushed back, or showed signs of trying to leave, he'd kill them, and then move on. He was efficient, he was patient, and most horrifying of all, he was methodical. Some of his earliest known behaviors included stalking, voyeurism, and arson. His mother described him as distant, quiet, but good. But school records and early interviews painted a different picture. He was abusive to girlfriends, he broke into homes, he attacked a former girlfriend's mother with a knife and received minimal punishment. The warning signs were everywhere, but because his targets were almost always women on the margins, sex workers, addicts, mentally ill, homeless, they weren't prioritized, they weren't protected. Some had even reported their concerns to local police in earlier years, saying Great had threatened or hurt them. But no action was taken. He used fake names, moved often, never held a stable job. Yet despite his record and the growing pattern of violence, he remained out of custody for years. The failure here wasn't just in catching him, it was in never really looking. He floated between Mansfield, Ashland, and Marion, always finding the next vulnerable woman to manipulate. He knew how to groom, he knew how to isolate. He often posed as a savior, offering food or rides or a place to sleep. He would then slowly strip away their autonomy, one threat at a time, until they were too frightened or too traumatized to escape. It wasn't just physical dominance, it was psychological siege. The final victim, whose 911 call exposed everything, wasn't his only survivor, just the only one who called in time. Several other women came forward after his arrest, describing encounters where Great had forced them into sex acts, held them against their will, or threatened them with weapons. Some had gone to the police, others had been too afraid. One woman described escaping by jumping from a moving car. Another said he told her she'd be the next body in the closet. He said it casually, like it was a joke he'd told before. The cruelty was normalized in his world. As the case grew, prosecutors struggled to grasp the full timeline of his crimes. There were gaps, bodies that had gone unclaimed, nameless victims, and Great, now imprisoned, seemed to revel in the confusion. He gave conflicting stories. He hinted at more murders. He taunted investigators with partial truths, sometimes laughing, sometimes pretending to weep. One moment he claimed he was saving women from their own sins. The next, he said he couldn't remember killing anyone. He played the martyr, then the monster, then the victim. And all the while, the families of those murdered sat in courtrooms listening to him describe their daughters as if they were broken objects he'd thrown away. It was a performance, but it worked. In 2018, he was sentenced to death for the murders of Elizabeth Griffith and Stacey Stanley, and he was later convicted of more killings in neighboring counties. He currently sits on death row in Chillicothe Correctional Institution. But the questions haven't stopped. How many women did he kill before the ones we know about? How many other small towns did he pass through, leaving just enough traces to be forgotten? And worst of all, how many other men like him are still out there? Because the truth is, Great wasn't a genius. He wasn't some criminal mastermind. He was sloppy. He was visible. He lived in homes people walked past every day. What protected him wasn't brilliance, it was apathy. Number one looked closely enough. No one investigated the smell coming from the house. No one reported the woman who went missing after moving in with a stranger. His crimes were built on a foundation of neglect. And that's what makes this case so terrifying. It's not just what he did. It's how long we let him do it. One more day, and that final victim would be dead. Her voice silenced like the others. That 911 call, barely a whisper, was the single razor-thin line between exposure and another cold case. It's proof that even the smallest act of resistance can tear down years of violence. And it's a reminder that killers like Great rely not on hiding, but on being ignored. They don't need masks, they just need us not to care. The most disturbing part of this case isn't how Sean Great killed. It's how close he came to never being caught at all. For every predator like Sean Great who leaves behind fingerprints, confessions, and a face to fear, there are others who remain nameless, faceless, and unsolved. Ghosts who turn land into graves and victims into questions. Because sometimes evil doesn't come in the form of a person you can arrest. Sometimes it comes in the form of an open desert, a patch of dry land, a stretch of nothing that hides everything. And when the wind shifts just right, when the bones start surfacing after a storm, we realize that someone out there buried their secrets deep and walked away. That's exactly what happened in 2009 on the southwestern edge of Albuquerque, New Mexico. A woman was walking her dog along the West Mesa, a scrubby, sun-blasted expanse of undeveloped land near a newly built housing development. The dog stopped, sniffed, dug, and unearthed a bone. Not a stick, not trash. A human femur. Police were called. The excavation began. What they uncovered was unlike anything the city had ever seen. 11 women, 1 unborn baby, all buried in shallow graves across a desolate patch of desert less than a mile from busy roads and homes. The media dubbed it the work of the West Mesa Bone Collector, but who he or she was remains a mystery to this day. The women ranged in age from 15 to 32. Most were Latina. All had disappeared between 2001 and 2005. Most were involved in sex work or struggling with addiction, women from the margins of society. Women often ignored. At first, their disappearances hadn't even been linked. Police believed they were transient, runaways. No one suspected a serial killer until the bodies appeared in that sun-baked dirt. 11 lives, each with a name, each with a family, each stolen, and whoever took them had taken their time. The burials were deliberate, methodical. Some graves were spaced apart as if plotted on a map. Others were grouped like offerings. The killer had returned multiple times, over years, to dump his victims in the same spot. That means he was confident. That means he wasn't worried about being caught. And that, more than anything, chilled detectives. The investigation became one of the largest in New Mexico history. Hundreds of leads, dozens of interviews. Satellite imagery was even pulled from NASA archives to track changes in the land. Investigators compared before and after photos, looking for signs of disturbed soil, vehicle tracks, tire impressions. But even with the most advanced technology, the killer's trail had gone cold. He hadn't just vanished, he had evaporated. There were suspects, of course. One was a former local cop with a history of domestic abuse and violence toward sex workers. Another was a convicted rapist who had lived near the area during the time of the murders. Both were investigated. Neither were charged. Some believed the killer was a truck driver, someone who could move in and out of the area without drawing attention. Others believed he might have been part of law enforcement or had military training. The graves suggested organization, planning, even ritual. But without DNA, without witnesses, without a single surviving victim, police were stuck. The desert had hidden him too well. What's particularly disturbing about the West Mesa case is how many of the women were reported missing and yet were never seriously pursued. Their families begged for help, filed reports, pled for attention, but too often they were dismissed, told their daughters were probably using drugs, that they'd turn up, that this wasn't unusual. It was only in death, when the bones were laid bare under a punishing sun, that the truth was finally acknowledged, that someone had been hunting them. The killer knew what he was doing. He chose victims who were vulnerable, women already on the edge of society. He may have befriended them, posed as a client, offered rides, promised money or a place to sleep, and then he didn't let them leave. Some were strangled, others showed signs of blunt force trauma. All were dumped like trash in a place no one looked until it was far too late. The families of the victims, people like Dan Valdez, whose daughter Michelle was among the dead, became relentless advocates. They pushed for answers, they built pressure, and still, year after year, no arrests were made. In 2010, the Albuquerque Police Department formed the 118th Street Task Force, named after the road closest to the graves. But even with that specialized unit, the case remained unsolved. Time wore on, leads thinned, and the land itself began to change. Developers returned to the area, building homes on land not far from the burial site. The brush was cleared, dirt was moved, and people started living just yards from where the killer once stood, shovel in hand. That contrast, the normalcy of suburban life built atop horror, is part of what makes this case unforgettable. Kids now play near where bones once rested. Lawns are watered, packages are delivered, and somewhere, someone who knows the truth is watching it all unfold. Maybe they live nearby, maybe they moved far away, but they walk among us, invisible, protected by time and distance and the silence of the dead. And perhaps the most disturbing part? Experts believe there are more victims. Women who vanished during the same period but haven't been found. The land stretches wide. Some parts are privately owned, others are inaccessible, and without a confession or tip, there's no way to know how many others lie just beneath the surface, waiting for a storm to reveal them, waiting for a dog to sniff too long in the wrong place, waiting for someone to finally connect the dots. Every few years, a tip emerges. A new name is floated, a possible suspect identified, but so far, none have stuck. The killer remains an open wound in New Mexico's history, and the women, 11 of them, with lives, dreams, families, are remembered not for how they lived, but how they were buried. It is a brutal legacy, and a chilling reminder that sometimes the worst monsters don't need to run. They just need a place no one watches. The trouble with digging up bones is that they rarely speak. They tell you where someone died, sometimes how, but not who did it or why. That's the agony behind the West Mesa investigation. 11 women and an unborn child, buried with no witnesses, no murder weapon, and no clear timeline. All law enforcement had were skeletal remains, soft theories, and a sea of missed opportunities. Because this wasn't just a killer who buried bodies. This was someone who learned how to operate in silence, someone who studied his surroundings and knew exactly which lives he could erase without a ripple. When the bodies were first discovered in 2009, the entire city reeled. It wasn't just the quantity, it was the invisibility. These women had all vanished between 2001 and 2005. That meant the killer had been active for nearly 5 years before a single trace of his crimes was uncovered. 5 years of hunting, 5 years of luring victims, 5 years of returning to the same desolate patch of desert with no one seeing him. That doesn't happen by accident. That's strategy. That's confidence. Whoever did this knew exactly who to target. Women with vulnerabilities. Many had prior arrests for prostitution. Others were battling addiction. Some were estranged from family or homeless at the time. These were victims chosen not just for accessibility, but for silence. The killer was counting on the system to fail them. And it did. Their disappearances were rarely treated as serious crimes. Some were never even classified as missing persons. Reports went unfiled, follow-ups weren't done, and families were told to wait, and wait, and wait. By the time anyone paid attention, the women had already been dead for years, their bones bleaching under the New Mexico sun. What little forensic evidence existed had been eaten by time. Most of the remains were incomplete, scattered by animals, weather, erosion. Some skulls were cracked, ribs broken. But with no flesh, there was no DNA from the killer, no fingerprints, no trace fibers. He had left them in a place designed to forget. The West Mesa itself was part of a long ignored expanse of desert, flanked by train tracks, construction zones, and a wastewater plant. It wasn't patrolled. It wasn't lit. It was a perfect dumping ground, and it had served that purpose over and over again. As investigators began mapping the burial sites, they noticed patterns, grave spacing, consistent orientation, signs that the killer had returned multiple times with new victims. He may have used the same shovel, the same route, the same access road. He may have stood in the same exact spot 11 times, each visit more brazen than the last. But still, no one saw him. One of the most compelling aspects of the investigation came from satellite imagery. Analysts pulled high-resolution aerial photos from 2003 through 2005, comparing shifts in vegetation and soil disturbance. In some frames, shallow depressions appear, then vanish months later. Some believe these are the actual graves, documented from space before the bodies were found. But even with that data, the killer's identity remained a blank. Hundreds of people were questioned. Dozens of suspects emerged. One was Lorenzo Montoya, a local man with a history of violence against women. He had lived near the burial site and had once been caught with a sex worker's body in his home. He was killed in 2006 by the boyfriend of another woman he had allegedly attacked. For a time, Montoya looked like the prime suspect, but the timeline didn't line up perfectly, and no physical evidence tied him to the site. Others looked into possible ties to sex trafficking rings, believing the murders may have been part of a larger operation, but no proof ever surfaced. The deeper detectives dug, the more hollow the case became. Every lead seemed to end in sand. The families, left to fill the silence, became investigators themselves. They held vigils, formed Facebook groups, tracked tips. A few even canvassed nearby truck stops and homeless shelters, trying to spot the missing faces in new crowds. They wanted to believe this was the work of one man, one monster, one person to blame. But a darker theory grew beneath the surface. What if this wasn't just one killer? What if it was multiple? A network, a circle of men sharing victims, locations, tactics. The burial pattern could have been learned, shared, imitated. It wasn't impossible. Serial killers don't always work alone. And in a place like West Mesa, forgotten, unregulated, outside the line of sight, anything was possible. One woman, whose sister was among the dead, said, "The scariest part is that it feels like it could still be happening, that maybe the only reason it stopped is because someone found the bones." And she may be right. Since 2005, when the killings appeared to stop, no new graves have been found. But the fact that no one noticed them for years doesn't mean they aren't there. The killer may have moved locations, found new ground, changed tactics, or died, or gone dormant. Serial killers sometimes stop when they feel the heat. Other times they evolve. They stop burying and start burning, or they move states or countries, and the silence resumes. In 2022, the FBI released an age-progressed sketch of a possible suspect based on witness interviews from the early 2000s, a man seen with some of the missing women before their disappearances. But sketches don't make arrests, and this one, like everything else in the case, faded into background noise. It's been over a decade since the graves were discovered, and still, no charges, no closure. Just a stretch of land that looks like every other stretch of land, except it isn't. Beneath that dirt is a cemetery no one planned, a place where the unprotected were taken and hidden by someone who understood one horrifying truth. If you kill the right kind of victim and bury her in the right kind of place, you can vanish. Not just physically, but from memory, from records, from consequence. And that is what the West Mesa bone collector did. He didn't just erase lives, he erased the evidence of their existence. And unless someone comes forward, unless another storm brings bones to the surface, he may stay erased too. If the West Mesa bone collector teaches us that evil can go unnoticed in silence, then the next case shows what happens when evil builds a throne for itself and dares the world to look away. Because not every killer hides under layers of mystery. Some construct their own stage, piece by piece, soundproof wall by soundproof wall, until their violence has a home, a system, a vocabulary. And when that home finally cracks open, what we find isn't just horror, it's ritual, it's design, it's industrial-scale depravity. Welcome to the case of David Parker Ray, known by those who've studied his crimes as the Toy Box Killer. But make no mistake, this wasn't a game. This was one of the most nightmarish torture operations in American criminal history, and it happened not in a major city, not in some underground bunker, but in the dusty, wide-open town of Elephant Butte, New Mexico. That's where Ray lived, right on the edge of Elephant Butte Lake, in a double-wide trailer that looked ordinary from the outside. But behind that trailer, parked under the sun like any other piece of property, was a cargo trailer, a metal box lined with insulation and filled with surgical tools, whips, chains, gags, saws, syringes, and a gynecological chair with restraints for the wrists and ankles. Mounted to the walls were diagrams of the human body. Shelves were stocked with sedatives and recording equipment. There were video cameras, there were mirrors, and there was a cassette tape, something Ray played for his victims when they woke up chained to the ceiling or strapped to the table. In the recording, Ray introduced himself, explained in cold detail what he planned to do to them, and instructed them not to scream because the trailer was soundproof. "Hello there, bitch," the recording begins. "Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it." From there, the tape descends into a terrifying manifesto. Ray described how he had captured them, what tools he'd use, how long they'd be held, what drugs were already in their system. He explained that they would be raped repeatedly, by him, by his friends, by his dog. He explained that some victims would survive, their memories wiped with heavy drugs and hypnosis. Others would not. It wasn't just sexual sadism. It was domination taken to an almost mechanical level, a factory of human suffering hidden in plain sight. For years, women had disappeared from the area. Some were hitchhikers, some sex workers, some just unlucky enough to cross Ray's path. Most had no memory of what happened. Those who did tried to tell authorities, but their stories sounded too unbelievable. And that's what Ray counted on: disbelief. Until one day, in March 1999, a woman named Cynthia Vigil escaped. She had been drugged, chained, and tortured for 3 days. When Ray left the keys on a table while distracted by a phone call, she grabbed them. Naked, bleeding, and in shock, she ran from the trailer and into a nearby mobile home, screaming for help. That homeowner called 911. Police arrived and arrested Ray, and with him, everything changed. When officers searched the trailer, they expected to find drugs, maybe stolen goods. What they found instead was a nightmare engineered with surgical precision. The walls were covered in weapons, clamps, and hooks. A leather-bound how-to manual written by Ray himself described methods of restraint, techniques for prolonged torture, and combinations of drugs to induce compliance. It read like a dark medical journal. A camera recovered from the site held videos of victims, some restrained, some unconscious, some appearing dead. But most disturbing was the list. Ray had kept meticulous records of women he'd captured, categorized by date, method, and outcome. Dozens of names. Yet only a handful had ever come forward. Many were never identified. Ray's girlfriend and accomplice, Cindy Hendy, was arrested with him. She confessed almost immediately, describing how she had helped lure victims, administer drugs, and assist in torture sessions. She claimed that Ray had killed at least 14 women, possibly more, and disposed of the bodies in nearby lakes and deserts. But no bodies were ever recovered. That lack of physical evidence became the biggest obstacle in the case. Ray was charged with kidnapping and sexual assault. Multiple women came forward. But without corpses, the murder charges wouldn't stick. Still, the details that emerged in trial were unlike anything the courtroom had ever seen. Victims testified about being raped with cattle prods, about being suspended in midair while Ray carved symbols into their skin, about being told their lives would end only after he got bored. Cynthia Vigil's testimony was so detailed, so harrowing, that some jurors reportedly wept. Even hardened detectives left the courtroom shaken. The FBI joined the investigation. Forensic anthropologists searched Ray's properties and nearby land for remains. Cadaver dogs were brought in. A lake was drained. But no remains were ever found. Some theorize he dissolved the bodies in acid. Others believe he buried them in remote stretches of desert no one's bothered to search. Ray himself never confessed to murder. He maintained that most women were released after having their minds erased with drugs. But this claim was chilling in itself, as it suggested not mercy, but manipulation. If he could make them forget, he could do it again. His trial dragged on. He was finally convicted in 2001, but before sentencing could take place, Ray died of a heart attack in prison. He never faced the full weight of justice. His girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, was sentenced to 36 years in prison, but was released in 2019 after serving 20. She now walks free. But the crimes they committed, what they did inside that trailer, live on in the minds of investigators, survivors, and anyone who's ever seen the photos from the scene. Because David Parker Ray wasn't just a killer. He was a technician of pain, a planner, a man who turned rape and murder into routine. And even more terrifying, he might have done it for decades. Authorities now believe his crimes stretch back to the 1980s, maybe earlier. Maybe there are dozens more women who never resurfaced, who were buried, burned, forgotten. But his notes remain, his recordings, his trailer, his blueprints of evil. And in the echoes of those recordings, where he calmly explained how and why he was about to destroy another life, you hear a voice not of rage, but of pride. And that is perhaps the darkest sound of all. Not all predators need shadows. Some wear polo shirts, shop at the grocery store next to you, run errands with their kids, and wave to the mailman from the end of their driveway. They don't just live among us. They thrive because we trust them, because their lawns are trimmed, their houses look safe, and their faces don't match the monsters we imagine. And that's what makes the next case so disturbing. Because while police hunted shadows in alleyways and back roads, a serial killer was watering his garden. His name was Herbert Baumeister, and his house wasn't a shack in the woods or a desert trailer. It was a $1 million Tudor-style estate called Fox Hollow Farm, nestled in the affluent suburbs of Westfield, Indiana. His crimes went unnoticed for years, not because they were subtle, but because the illusion around him was so convincing. To neighbors, he was a mild-mannered husband and father, a successful businessman who owned a chain of thrift stores called Save-A-Lot. But underneath that image was a man who lured young men to his home, murdered them in secret, and buried their remains, bones, skulls, full skeletons, right in his backyard. and no one suspected a thing until the ground itself began to tell the truth. In the early 1990s, gay men were disappearing from the Indianapolis area, one by one, all young, all healthy, all last seen at local gay bars. Their cases were often dismissed by police, classified as runaways or low-priority adults. But when a man named Tony Harris came forward, everything changed. Harris had narrowly escaped a man who tried to strangle him during what was supposed to be a consensual encounter. That man was Herb Baumeister. Harris reported the incident to police, but without evidence they couldn't act. So Harris worked with a detective to wear a wire and go back twice, trying to get Baumeister to incriminate himself. He didn't, but something wasn't right. At the same time, remains were being discovered in rural areas outside the city, bones that had been gnawed on, burned, and scattered. The pattern was real, even if no one had been charged. Police started connecting the dots. Eventually, they approached Baumeister and asked to search his property. He refused, repeatedly. Since there wasn't enough probable cause, they were stuck, so they waited. Until one day, when Baumeister's wife, separated and scared, granted them permission to search Fox Hollow Farm while Herb was out of town. What they found would haunt the state of Indiana forever. Behind the house, near the edge of the woods, investigators began unearthing bones, hundreds of them, scattered across the property, burned, crushed, left to decay in shallow dirt. Vertebrae, femurs, skull fragments, over 10,000 bones and bone fragments were recovered. At least 11 victims were confirmed. Only a few were ever fully identified. The others, pieces of boys who vanished without a trace, were never matched to names. The horror wasn't just in the killing, it was in the casualness. Baumeister had hosted cookouts and pool parties in the same yard where his victims were decomposing. His children played in the woods. Guests walked unknowingly past burial sites. And through it all, he maintained the image of a stressed but decent family man, just trying to run a business and raise a family. When news broke that police were searching his home, Baumeister fled to Ontario, Canada. He didn't run for long. Just days later, he was found dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. No trial, no confession, just a suicide note that made no mention of the bodies or the crimes. He left behind no explanation, only silence. But his home, Fox Hollow Farm, became an open grave. Forensic teams worked for months to collect and analyze the remains: teeth, jawbones, hands. Some victims had been dismembered, others left mostly intact. There was evidence of strangulation. The backyard was so densely packed with bone that experts said it was impossible to tell how many bodies had been there. The victims were all young men, between 20 and 30 years old. Many of them had been missing for years. All of them had vanished after a night out. Baumeister had a system. He would cruise gay bars in Indianapolis and look for men who were alone. He'd offer them drinks, sometimes drugs, and then suggest a ride back to his estate. There, he had a private indoor pool. He often encouraged the men to drink heavily. Some reports say he videotaped his attacks. Most of the killings took place during sex acts involving asphyxiation, either through ligature or manual strangulation. It's believed Baumeister derived pleasure from watching his victims die slowly. He would then carry the bodies outside under the cover of night, bury them shallowly, or burn them in fire pits. His control over the scene was total. No one heard screams. No one asked questions. His wife later told police she had never entered the pool area alone and that he had become increasingly erratic over the years. She suspected something was wrong, but not this. Never this. After his death, more chilling details emerged. Authorities found gay pornography, mannequins arranged in sexual positions, and hundreds of videotapes, many unlabeled. Though no snuff films were confirmed, some believe these tapes may contain footage of the murders. Their contents remain tightly sealed by the state. To this day, the full number of victims is unknown. The 11 bodies found are believed to be just a portion of Baumeister's total kill count. Some speculate he may be connected to additional disappearances along Interstate 70, where bodies of young men had been found in similar conditions. The FBI believes his victim count may exceed 20. The case remains technically open, even decades later. But with Baumeister dead, no justice was served. Only fragments remain. His house was sold. The woods still stand. And to this day, locals whisper about Fox Hollow Farm as if it's alive. Some say the new owners hear footsteps near the back gate. Others say they've seen faces in the pool room windows. But whether the stories are true or not, one fact is certain: evil lived there. Not in the form of a monster or a madman, but in a man with a nameplate on his office door, a father with Christmas photos, a homeowner with lawn care receipts. And for years, while the world looked elsewhere, he was digging holes in his backyard, filling them with the dead, smiling while he did it. And when he was finally discovered, he vanished in one final act of control, leaving the answers buried with the bodies. The dead don't stay buried, not really. You can cover them with soil, you can deny them names, you can reduce them to fragments of jaw or femur, but the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when it was never supposed to be found. That's what happened in the aftermath of the Baumeister case. Police, forensic teams, and volunteers spent months sifting through the grounds of Fox Hollow Farm, often by hand, sometimes with dental tools, piecing together tiny bits of bone that once belonged to sons, brothers, lovers. Some were found clustered near fire pits, others beneath fallen brush and loose rock. One skull was located behind a fence, less than 20 yards from where the family's children had played. But identifying the remains was another nightmare altogether. Most of the bones had been weathered by heat and time. DNA extraction was still a developing science in the 1990s, and many samples yielded no viable results. Forensic anthropologists were forced to rely on dental records, fracture patterns, and comparisons to missing persons reports. Even with these methods, only 8 of the 11 sets of remains were ever conclusively identified. The others remain known only by reference numbers, case files without names, human stories reduced to catalogued evidence. For the families of the victims, the process was brutal. Many had reported their loved ones missing years earlier, only to be told they'd likely run off or didn't want to be found. Several were members of the gay community, and police at the time gave those cases little urgency. It was only after the discovery at Fox Hollow that those reports were reopened, and by then, the families were dealing with the grim realization that they might never get their sons' full remains back. Some were given a handful of bone fragments in a sealed bag. Others received nothing but a confirmation from dental charts. One mother said, "He vanished in 1991. I waited for him to come home every day. Now I find out he was rotting under someone's swing set." The trauma didn't end with discovery, it began with it. And while Baumeister had ended his own life in a park in Ontario with a single shot to the head, he had denied every one of his victims the same kind of closure. No apologies, no confessions, no maps, just bones and questions. In the years following, the state attempted to piece together a psychological profile. What they found was deeply unsettling. Baumeister had no criminal record. He had been married for over 20 years. He had 3 children. He co-owned a business that employed dozens. On paper, he was functional. But underneath that paper was something warped. Colleagues described him as distant, eccentric, prone to inappropriate jokes. His wife, Juliana, said his behavior had changed in the mid-1980s, that he had begun drinking heavily, disappearing at night, becoming cold and paranoid. Still, she claimed she had no idea he was capable of murder. She said he never allowed her into the pool house. He claimed it was where he unwound. She believed him. Others close to Baumeister recalled bizarre behaviors. He would talk about the decomposition process in detail, obsess over roadkill, and once brought home a dead crow to examine its skeleton. No one reported him. No one thought to dig. That silence is part of the horror. Baumeister operated in a community built on appearances. It was easier to believe he was just a little odd than to imagine what he really was. Even after the bodies were found, many neighbors were hesitant to talk. One told a reporter, "You don't expect something like this in a place like this." That sentiment, so naive, so dangerous, is exactly what allowed Baumeister to thrive. And it didn't end after his death. The house, Fox Hollow Farm, was sold to new owners who were aware of the history. They tried to move on. They remodeled, repainted, rebuilt parts of the yard. But the past has a way of clinging. Contractors refused to work on the property. Children claimed to see figures in the woods. Paranormal investigators began showing up with cameras and EVP recorders, claiming to hear whispers in the pool house. Whether any of that is real doesn't matter. The memory is what haunts the place. Every window, every corner, every stone in that yard is part of a crime scene. A monument not to a madman, but to a man who hid madness behind politeness, wealth, and the benefit of the doubt. In 2016, one of Baumeister's surviving sons publicly acknowledged the case for the first time. He said he remembered his father as quiet and distant, but not violent. He said learning what had been buried just steps from where he played as a child had broken something inside him that would never heal. And he wasn't alone. The trauma of this case extended far beyond the victims. It hit the community. It changed how police approached missing persons cases. It forced law enforcement to confront their own biases, especially around LGBTQ+ victims. But many believe it didn't go far enough. Some detectives, now retired, still believe Baumeister killed far more than the 11 bodies recovered. Some suspect he dumped victims off the property, possibly along Interstate 70 or other remote stretches of road. There are open cases in Ohio and Illinois that match his M.O. young men, missing after bar visits, last seen with a man matching his description. But without evidence, those links remain theories. What is not theory is this. Herbert Baumeister got away with it, for years, right under everyone's nose. And even when the walls started closing in, he made sure he died on his own terms, leaving behind a trail of destruction and no accountability. That is what makes his story so uniquely disturbing. Not the number of bodies, not the details of the murders, but the quiet, the smiles, the afternoon barbecues, the silence of a suburban home where the backyard was a graveyard and no one asked questions. His crimes didn't just bury people, they buried truth, and decades later, we're still digging. For some killers, the house is the secret. With Herbert Baumeister, it was the backyard, manicured, private, curated to conceal horror beneath a suburban shell. But the next case asks a more horrifying question. What if the house doesn't just hide the crimes? What if it absorbs them? What if the rooms you eat in, sleep in, live in, are filled with rot and no one says a word? That's what happened in Poughkeepsie, New York, where another man quietly transformed his home into a crypt while his parents and sister lived alongside the stench of death. No backyard burials, no wilderness, just bodies stored indoors, stacked in crawl spaces, hidden behind walls, decomposing a few feet from dinner. The killer's name was Kendall Francois. He was not a shadowy drifter. He wasn't a genius, nor particularly cunning. He was a janitor at a local middle school, a teacher's aide. He lived with his family in a modest house at 99 Fulton Avenue, a house that would, by the end of the investigation, be referred to as the House of Horrors by every major newspaper in the state. Between 1996 and 1998, Francois murdered at least 8 women, all of them sex workers operating in the Poughkeepsie area. Their names were Wendy Myers, Gina Barone, Catherine Marsh, Michelle Eason, Mary Giacconi, Sandra French, Katina Newmaster, and Pamela Rinaldi. These women had families, pasts, stories, but they had also been pushed to the margins of society. Some struggled with addiction, others were living unhoused or were in and out of shelters. And Francois knew that. He picked them up under the pretense of paid sex, drove them to the house he shared with his family, led them to his bedroom or bathroom, and then he killed them, usually through strangulation. The motive wasn't just sexual violence, it was control, power, and what came after was even more disturbing. Francois didn't bury his victims. He kept them, for days, for weeks, in closets, under floorboards, behind false walls. One woman was stuffed into a box, another was left under insulation in the attic. The decomposition was severe, insects infested the house. The smell was described by visitors as nauseating, sour, overwhelming. One officer, after entering the home, said it took weeks to stop dry heaving every time he remembered it. And yet somehow, the family stayed. Francois's parents and sister all claimed they were aware of the smell, but thought it was due to plumbing or a dead rat in the wall. They denied knowledge of the murders. Investigators could never prove they were complicit. But they lived there, slept there, ate there, all while their son and brother quietly stored corpses upstairs. The question that still disturbs investigators isn't just, how did he do it? But how was it allowed to go on so long? Because Francois didn't kill and hide. He killed and kept. And the police? They missed him, again and again. The women he targeted had all been reported missing. Their names were on active lists. Some families called multiple times, begged for follow-up, handed over photos. Police questioned Francois several times during the disappearance wave. He had prior arrests for soliciting sex workers. He had a known presence in the area where the women vanished. But every time he was interviewed, he was calm, polite, articulate. They let him go. One officer even noted in his report, "Doesn't seem likely." That's how close they were. That's how close the women came to justice, only to be failed again. Until one woman survived. On September 1st, 1998, Francois picked up a woman named Christine Sala. She had worked in the streets before, knew the risks, but was desperate for money. Francois drove her to his house, led her inside, and attempted to rape her. When she fought back, he tried to strangle her. She clawed at his face, kneed him in the groin, and somehow got free. She ran, she screamed, and she went to the police. At first, no one took her seriously, but she insisted, described the house in detail, named him, pressured them to act. And finally, they searched 99 Fulton Avenue. What they found was something no training could prepare them for. The moment officers opened the front door, the stench hit like a wall. It was biological, wet, unnatural. They moved carefully, armed with search warrants, flashlights cutting through the gloom, and then they started finding them. One body, then another, until the count reached 8. Bones in bags, flesh in corners, maggots crawling through carpet. One woman had been partially mummified by air exposure. Another was liquefied by heat and moisture. All of it, inside one house. Francois was arrested on the spot. He didn't resist. In fact, he talked, confessed, explained what he did, why he did it. His tone was flat, matter of fact. He said the women disrespected him. He said he got angry, that they needed to learn. He didn't see them as human. He referred to them by race, by nickname, but rarely by name. When asked how he lived with the smell, he shrugged, said he got used to it, like it was nothing, a bad habit, an inconvenience. He showed no remorse. His trial was brief, his confession airtight. He pled guilty to all 8 murders in exchange for a life sentence to avoid the death penalty. He was sent to the Sullivan Correctional Facility. In 2014, he died of apparent natural causes, possibly AIDS-related complications, after serving just 16 years. No final words, no apology, just gone. And the house, it was demolished, bulldozed, reclaimed by the city. But the damage remains, etched in the memory of every officer who walked those hallways, every family who waited for news, every neighbor who asked, too late, could we have known? Francois represents a specific kind of horror, the domestic predator, not the monster in the woods, not the ritual killer with a manifesto, but the man next door with keys to the school, a smile in the grocery aisle, and corpses rotting upstairs while his family made dinner below. He didn't hide behind madness, he hid behind routine, and for 2 years, that was all he needed. It's easy to blame one man, one monster, one predator who hid bodies beneath insulation and ductwork while pretending to be nothing more than a quiet school janitor. But in the aftermath of Kendall Francois' arrest, as investigators sifted through the house and families gathered the fragments of their daughters' lives, another question rose from the stench. Who else is responsible? Because a crime like this doesn't go unnoticed. Not entirely. Not for 2 straight years in a middle-class home surrounded by neighbors, co-workers, police stations, teachers, and community leaders. The reality is, Francois was not just a killer, he was a test, and nearly every system around him failed. He was interviewed at least 5 times during the investigation into the missing women, 5 times. He lived just blocks away from where the women disappeared. His name appeared in witness tips. He was known to frequent the same strip where victims were last seen. He even had past charges related to solicitation, but each time the cases were dropped or deprioritized. There were no warrants, no surveillance, no real suspicion. Why? Because the women he killed were sex workers, poor, addicted, some without homes, others without close family. In other words, disposable in the eyes of the system. Francois weaponized that fact. He didn't need to be brilliant, he just needed to pick the right victims. And he knew the right victims were the ones no one would look for until it was too late. The Poughkeepsie Police Department faced heavy criticism after the arrest. Internal reviews revealed that connections between the missing persons cases had been discussed, but never fully pursued. Some officers said they lacked resources. Others admitted the cases didn't get priority because of the victims' lifestyles. Families who had begged for help, who had posted flyers, walked the streets, made phone calls, were told their daughters were probably fine. One woman who lost her sister said, they waited for him to screw up. Meanwhile, she was decomposing in his attic. That's the true horror here, not just the murders, but the preventability. One survivor's bravery cracked the case open, but how many others had nearly escaped? How many red flags had to be ignored before someone acted? The city of Poughkeepsie, once known for its quiet charm, found itself in the national spotlight, and not in a way it could recover from easily. The house at 99 Fulton Avenue became a symbol. Journalists came from all over the country. Reporters filmed the home from across the street. Psychologists offered theories. Sociologists used it as a case study in systemic failure. People wanted to know how a house full of bodies could exist for so long without anyone noticing. And while many blamed the family, investigators were never able to prove their knowledge. Francois's parents and sister all denied any involvement. They admitted the smell was unbearable, but said they believed it was mold or sewage. Some questioned their sincerity. Others wondered if they were victims of psychological manipulation themselves, living under a roof with a killer whose crimes they had emotionally buried to protect the illusion of family. Francois, for his part, never fully explained his mindset. During interrogation, he was calm, cold. When asked why he killed, he said he lost control. When pressed on whether he felt guilt, he shrugged, said it didn't help. He spoke of the women not by name, but by number, by description. The tall one, the blonde, the one with the bad teeth. He never once cried, never once faltered. And when he was sentenced to life in prison, he showed no reaction, no apologies, no remorse, just the same blank expression he'd worn in his mugshot. But it's what came after that makes the case even darker. While in prison, Francois gave occasional interviews. He never recanted, never sought forgiveness. He did, however, try to rationalize. Said some of the women provoked him, said they tried to steal, or disrespected him. These are the hallmarks of serial narcissists, killers who construct emotional myths to justify their violence. Francois didn't kill because he lost control. He killed because he wanted to, and he kept the bodies because he liked knowing they couldn't leave. That's the truth investigators were left with. A man who lived in filth, surrounded by death, unaffected. A man who showered, ate meals, slept, watched TV, all while bodies decayed feet away. What kind of psychology does that take? Experts describe it as compartmentalization of the highest order. Francois was capable of performing daily tasks, working, conversing, following routines, while entirely suppressing the part of his mind that understood morality, and while it's tempting to label him insane, that's not what the experts concluded. He wasn't delusional. He knew right from wrong. He just didn't care. And when a killer doesn't care, when they feel no need to hide, explain, or justify, they become almost impossible to detect until it's too late. That's what made Francois so terrifying. He wasn't chaotic. He wasn't reckless. He simply calculated the value of his victims based on how little the world cared about them. And he was right. The women he murdered had been invisible in life and almost invisible in death, until one of them refused to go quietly, until one of them survived. That 911 call, that police report, that single act of defiance, did what years of missing persons reports and search efforts had failed to do. It exposed a predator, not in the forest, not in the desert, but in a house with blinds, a lawn, a mailbox. And with that discovery, the case of Kendall Francois became something bigger than one man's crimes. It became a mirror, forcing law enforcement, cities, and entire communities to ask how many other homes like that exist. How many killers don't need to run because the system lets them stay? And how many victims are never found, not because they're hidden too well, but because no one bothered to look? When you step back from the evidence boxes, the witness statements, the mugshots, the bones in the backyard, a different kind of horror begins to take shape, one that has nothing to do with murder weapons or forensics. It's the horror of realization, because all 5 of these men, whether they used poison, ropes, cement floors, crawl spaces, or their bare hands, shared one trait far more dangerous than cruelty: invisibility. Not the kind that hides in the shadows, but the kind that waves politely. That blends. That knows the world will look away if the victims are poor, marginalized, addicted, or simply inconvenient. From the poisoned pills in Chicago's convenience stores to the decomposing women in Kendall Francois' walls, these killers operated on the assumption that silence protects. And it did. Not just for a few days or weeks, but for years. In Great's case, it took a barely whispered 911 call from a woman tied to a mattress to break the spell. In Baumeister's, the land had to literally erode before the truth surfaced. And in the deserts of New Mexico, it was a dog pawing at the ground that gave the dead a voice. These are not clever twists in a movie. These are failures. By police departments, by neighborhoods, by systems built to protect only some. And the most terrifying part? None of these men fit the profile you've been taught to expect. There were no wild-eyed lunatics, no rambling manifestos left at the scene, no screams in the middle of the night. There were fathers, janitors, clerks, homeowners, the kind of men you pass in the aisle of a gas station and nod at politely, the kind of men who lived in houses just like yours. One even brought sandwiches to school functions while human remains lay in his attic. Another attended church, held steady jobs, and maintained his lawn to the inch. They weren't monsters by appearance. They were monsters because they understood what you didn't, that evil doesn't need to roar. It only needs to be ignored. These killers didn't just find victims. They selected silence. They hunted in neighborhoods where the missing wouldn't make headlines. They watched the news and saw that certain faces never stayed on screen. They knew that a girl without a home, without a father, without a future was easier to erase than a girl with college tuition. And they were right. That's the chilling thread running through this documentary. Not just that these crimes happened, but that they worked. That these men built patterns and systems and rituals and got away with it for years. And we let them. Not because we condone evil, but because we underestimated it. We thought it would come in black vans and ski masks. We didn't expect it in khakis, behind cashier counters, or beneath ceiling fans. We thought we'd see it coming, but we didn't. That's what makes these cases more than true crime. They are blueprints of how horror survives. It survives through routine, through apathy, through assumptions. It survives when we decide which victims are worth pursuing and which ones aren't. It survives when we train ourselves to ignore certain kinds of pain, certain kinds of people. That's what each of these cases show us. That the system isn't just flawed, it's vulnerable to predators who understand its blind spots better than its architects. And now, long after the headlines have faded, after the courtrooms have emptied, after the homes have been sold or bulldozed, the question left behind is not just who did this, but who's still doing it. Because the next one won't look like the last. And if history has taught us anything, it's that evil never vanishes. It evolves. It waits. It watches. And it smiles when we look away.